We are live. Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project. I'm Rob Kalwarowsky, and as always, the yang to my yin out of Toronto, not wearing glasses today, Susan Hobson. Susan, how are you?
I learned my lesson the hard way last time, didn't I? And oh yeah, that feedback is gold. So I left those ones to the side today. I'm fabulous. I'm fired up. I am staring at the most gorgeous sunset. It's like purple and pink and blue. And I just had to have that as an attitude of gratitude moment before we get this party started.
Well, you're lucky. I'm looking out my window. We've had snow literally every day since November 1st, and it's minus 20 degrees outside. So, welcome to Edmonton, and hence why I'm moving to Costa Rica.
And hence why we got to get warm on the inside with this interview, right?
That's right. And obviously, we have to start off with a quote. And I have one here from Azria Becker, who's hosting one of the groups that I'm in. And she says, "From the void within, the wisdom emerges." And obviously, it resonates with both Susan and I, and from some of the darkness and what we talk about, and for me, my mental health. And it's going to transition beautifully into our guest today. Nick Jonsson's here with us. He's the co-founder and managing director of EGN. He's the Singapore's top 100 entrepreneur 2021 winner, and he's top 1% in the world in IRONMAN. So he's got it all. Nick Jonsson. Nick, how are you?
I'm great, Rob. Thank you so much for the warm invitation. And hi, Susan, as well. Lovely to be here.
We love to have you. And obviously, Nick, we're huge in athletics on this show. Susan was big in hockey. I was a big water polo player. So we want to start off here one is tell us a little bit about the Ironmans, and then also, what have you learned about leadership from Ironmans?
That's what I want to know.
Well, I think, an Ironman race, and for those who don't know, and I know kilometers, so you have to convert it to miles, but it's a swim of 3.8 kilometers, it's 180 kilometer bike ride, and then you run a marathon at the end. But basically you have about 16 hours to do that. That's the cutoff time, 16 and a half, depending on what race. So what I say, it's almost a simulation of a life, because life also has its up and down, and you go through the pain, the glory, and so on. But most importantly, and if we link this back to leadership, the closer you are to the finish line, the more pain you're going through, the more difficult it is, the closer you are to give up, and the self-doubt comes all over you, and the emotions that are building up, and then you cross the finish line and you made it. That is what I think that is what I just keep chasing, because you have that day when you're going through all these challenges, and afterwards you're just so happy that you pushed through, you didn't give up on yourself, you hang in there.
I love this, right? This is really where you discover all that untapped potential, right? Is in the presence of that pain and that challenge and that adversity. So, of course, that's a perfect metaphor for life and for business. I mean, I know all of our leaders out there listening today can certainly relate to that. This last 3 years has felt a little bit like an Ironman. I'm not going to lie. But before we get there, I just want you to plug our folks into a little bit more about yourself and the mission that you're on in the world as a leader today.
Right. So basically, I was born in Sweden, but I left '98 for Australia, which was as far away as I could from home. I studied there, played some golf over there, but then I realized I was too far away from home. So I looked at a map and where can I go, which is halfway? And I ended up in Southeast Asia. And there I've been since 2004. And I worked in leadership roles, mainly in Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the last 5 years in Singapore. So I worked my way up, basically starting from an account executive up to managing director, leading quite big, working for big international firms and so on, with running big teams in these markets. So that's my career journey. These days, my life is quite different. I'm an entrepreneur for a couple of years, where I'm running confidential peer groups for senior executives here in Singapore.
Ooh, what does that mean? Confidential peer groups for senior executives, for all of those people out there listening, including Mr. Winston. He wants to know. What does that exactly mean?
Well, what I learned, Susan, from my career was that it can be quite lonely at the top, as they say. And if I'm looking back at my own career, I wish that I was a bit more vulnerable as a leader. I wish I had a safe place outside my workplace where I could discuss my challenges. Instead, I went home with the pressures. I kept them inside me. I felt, well, I'm the boss, so I should be able to handle this. This is normal. This is leadership. But these days I know differently, and that's from running these peer groups. So what we do then is that we create groups with about 30, 35 executives who meet in a confidential space without competitors. They sign a non-disclosure agreement. We have a moderator in these sessions, and they are 4 hours, which means we're allowed to go deep. Everyone bring in the challenges they're facing in the work, and we facilitate it to help them solve the problems they're going through.
And what are some of the biggest challenges that you see in those confidential spaces? And obviously, we don't need to reveal the names of any of the people that are challenged with these things, but I'm just curious, what have you calibrated are some of those biggest themes that leaders struggle with?
Well, I have a pretty good insight because I joined plenty of them. We have more than 120 of them in Singapore this year. So I'm almost daily in these sessions, and I listen so I really know what's going on out there. And of course, at this moment, the biggest challenge the leaders have is with recruitment and staff retention and talent, but also how to connect with the younger generation, how to understand them and how to communicate. But otherwise, it's also a lot about managing upwards, putting parameters around yourself, managing your life and your boss. These are all the issues that, they are facing, and that compounds and create huge pressures if you are not sure how to manage this.
Sorry, I had to go on mute a little bit there. But Nick, you talked a little bit about wanting to be more vulnerable when you were a leader. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, I also, if I'm looking back at my career, I wasn't enough, should I say, transparent or vulnerable. I was trying to perhaps hide some of the things I had. And that was something that we were told, I'm an expat as well, which means that I'm a foreigner working in these different countries, being the leader. And in one company I was working, we were leading hospitals and medical clinics all over Indonesia. There was over 1,000 local staff, and a few of us were foreigners. So of course they're looking at you when you're showing up. If you're driving a car, they're coming with a bus, and you have those differences already there from the beginning. So you're trying to keep a little bit of a distance, and you are even encouraged to not expose yourself too much. And that is very difficult, because these days I know that's what we need to do. We need to not to show off the entitlements we have, but we need to show that we're humans, that we also are not perfect. We need to show that we make mistakes, and it's okay to make mistakes, and really to create that safe, open culture. But everything I was told the whole time was to not go there, and that was why it was so painful to lead in that environment.
Mm-hmm. That's the piece I want you to plug our people into, is the why. Why is it so important for us to learn? Because I do believe, coming off the heels of everything we've been taught all these years in leadership, right, in terms of what leadership is. Yeah. So why is that so important for us to learn how to show up in vulnerable ways as a leader?
Well, if we don't show up in a vulnerable way, our team won't show up in a vulnerable way. And that means that we will have what you guys are talking about. Also, I've seen your videos about the toxic working environment and the culture. This is what will happen. And it starts with the leader. If the leader comes in and don't share and don't show that they are humans, the team will show up the same. And that's, what I've seen is happening. And then you're just going to have a very cold culture. And it's not a pleasant place to be. And that's the culture that I worked in most of my years. And that's why I'm now an advocate for not having that kind of working culture.
And this totally connects to the loneliness at the top that you referenced at the top of this interview, right? This totally connects to why we have such an attrition problem right now in the talent space, and why it's so hard for people to keep their top talent, right? Is because we're still coming home to this fact that we need to be humans as leaders. But that's also something that impacts, like you were saying, with the loneliness piece, right? Like there's no sustainability to that, because that's going to impact everybody's mental health, right? Like if you don't have that safe space where people feel that they can come and actually be real with one another.
Yes, absolutely, Susan. And that's what I wanted to look into then. So when I basically converted my career from being a top executive into running these confidential peer groups. And the first year then in 2016, 17, when I joined these meetings, I was listening for the leaders, and I could also feel that, oh my God, it's not only me who felt so lonely. It's not only me who had these feelings as a leader. This is common. And I realized, that this was what's on everyone's mind. So in 2019, I actually did a survey where I surveyed the executives inside the network to ask them about, their loneliness, their mental health state, and so on. And the findings was basically that it spoke for themselves. 30% of them felt isolated in the workplace. And here are the decision makers. So imagine the culture of these companies if 30% of the executives are feeling isolated in their own company they are leading.
I can't imagine it's a pretty wake, right? Like in terms of the impact that leader is having from that space and place of isolation. That obviously is going to impact the mental health of the people, right?
Yes, absolutely, Susan. So that is, was the first question then in the survey. And then the follow-up question was, okay, so if you're not feeling well, is this something that you talk about in your company with anyone? It can be your boss, your HR, or what about your teams? And actually 84% are not talking to anyone in the company about it. So that means they're keeping it to themselves.
Mm-hmm. What do you see buried in that stat?
Well, obviously, just like myself, that we're dealing with it in different ways. And in my way, for some extent, it was, trying to go through and treating it like an IRONMAN race, just push through it, But if you don't vent this, eventually there's no finish line. So I didn't have any relief from it. And that led me to stop exercising. I lost weight. I was starting eating bad food. And then before I knew it, I started to drink alcohol after work instead. And that became an addiction. And I was on a slippery slope where in 2017 and early 2018, I had a complete health crisis.
And how did you turn it around?
Well, I had to hit rock bottom before I could turn around. Actually, it went so far that in April 2018, I couldn't see any way out of it. I started to write my will. I wrote my testament. I sent all my bank details and all my information to my ex-wife, because during this I also went through divorce. I sent it to my parents. I sent it to my son. I sent it to everyone. Basically, I was cleaning up my act, and I wasn't suicidal, but I couldn't at this stage break away from the alcohol addiction. And I looked at myself realizing that I don't have much longer to go. If I continue down this path, I'm going to be gone soon. And I didn't want anyone to have to sort out this mess. But back then I hit the rock bottom. And as they say, I got the gift of desperation. I just had to turn things around. And the life-saving thing was that I met a lady I remarried. And she's today my wife, and I told her how I felt. And this was the first time in my life I had spoken the truth about my feelings. And from there on, it all went upwards.
It's an incredible story.
Yeah, so, everyone asked me, what was the turning point? And it was just by sharing to her how I felt. Because when you share how you feel to anybody, it doesn't matter who it is, just by speaking the words, I would say that half the problem is solved already. Of course, when she heard this, and she was in complete shock, because we as people, humans, are so good to hold it together, and hiding it, she had no idea. So when I was going out drinking with her, she thought we were having a great time. She thought I was enjoying myself. She thought I deserved it. I worked hard. It's okay to go out and have a good time. She didn't know that I felt empty inside. She had no idea. But then, of course, immediately she said, Nick, let's go to a doctor to talk about that. And that's what we did. She joined me immediately. And because I was quite shy to tell the doctor what was going on, she was talking for half an hour, telling the doctor the full truth. And of course, the doctor took immediate action. And with that also, I was introduced to an anonymous support group to deal with my alcohol addiction. So within 24 hours, I was in the room there and I shared my story with them. And in the room, I realized that there was 25 others. And in this group was mainly senior executives themselves who'd gone through something similar before. And they were there, having broken away from the addiction 3 months ago, 1 year ago, 20 years ago, and sharing how grateful they were, how well they were today. And that's when I thought, okay, that's what I will copy then. And now I'm 5 years soon into my recovery and I never felt better.
Incredible.
It's amazing.
And it's wild, right? And I've suffered with mental illness for a long time. 2011, a suicide attempt in 2013, and I met Susan in 2019, and she might have been the first person that I felt actually saw me. And I talk about it now and I say that the rock bottom, it wasn't that movement for me that was like, oh, movie, Rocky Rising and all that stuff. But it took the slog to find the support system to put all that in place. And that was really, and Susan seen it. It took me probably about 2 years since I met her to find the right therapist, the right medication, all the pieces. And it is a journey in itself. But just like you, Nick, I feel the best I've ever felt. And I think that you're totally right, is having the power of support from people around you that you can be open about is incredibly healing.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that, Rob. And indeed, it is the people we're surrounded by. And I often talk about we need two forms of network. We need a personal network and we need a professional network, because we need a personal network to talk about the issues we're facing, perhaps outside of work. We need to have some close friends who we can be vulnerable with. But when it comes to a professional network, and that is what I'm working with now, is that you need to have that safe space with other people who have similar jobs, who can understand you. So if you are a senior executive in a HR company, then you probably need to have your professional network with the HR executives. The issue is that many have a social network with other HR executives. They might go to the conferences, they go to the exhibitions, they are drinking wine together, they're having a jolly time together, they're only sharing the good moments. But are they getting vulnerable? No. That is the major issue with, I would say, networking and all of these organizations. So you need to really also have a professional body there. And if you're an entrepreneur and a business owner, then you need to have I would say, a confidential space where you can discuss the pressures, the cash flow issues you're going through, because there's a lot of pressure there, how to manage the boards, getting funding if you need for your cash flow and so on. And discuss that then with 20 other founders and working together. That is where you get the relief, and that is where the pressure comes off your shoulders.
And then how do you take that relief of pressure and then start to open up space in your working world, in the context of your organization or the teams that you're leading, so that you can actually then start to feel less isolated there?
Well, I think if you practice it as a leader first in a confidential space outside your workplace, and it doesn't have to be the kind of peer groups we run. It can be a mastermind group. These are quite popular. They set up your own mastermind group with a couple of others who are in your kind of space, and you run that together and you practice in there to discuss and become vulnerable. Then you can, of course, take this across to your team. And I run these kind of peer groups internally in my organization. With my sales team, we have our own peer group, and we will meet in person in December for 4 hours. We meet every other month 2 hours on Zoom together, but sometimes it's important also to meet together. And we take turns then. So in this 4-hour session, there's typically one of the sales leaders who will go up and present, some major challenge this person have. It can be in the discovery call with potential clients. It can be in the closing. It can be any part of the sales process that this person feels this is where I'm having some issues. So they need to stand up there and present this. And then all of us will help them work on this and challenge it and support him. So hopefully he will leave this session knowing that and having this feeling that, okay, that was a bit painful. I was vulnerable. I shared what I'm having issues with, but everyone took it in the right way and helped me solve it. And that is, if you then move on from this session, then you can imagine the team environment after that. They will be open to each other and willing to help each other instead of judging and blaming.
I love that. And Nick, I'm just curious, do you see in your groups, do you see mostly men or women, or who's coming to the table with you?
So we are constantly striving for having diversity. In fact, even on my bookshelf behind me here is a book which I wrote with the Swedish Chamber of Commerce on diversity and inclusion. So I would love us to have 50% women and 50% men in the peer groups, but it's about 27% of our members are women now. We're constantly working on getting more. It's also a little bit harder to get women to show up. I think they are more loyal to the duties and showing up at work and being there for the boss and everyone around us. We men tend to be perhaps a little bit more should I say, empowering our decisions to just go out and get it done. Maybe that's at least what I see in general. But yeah, we're really trying to have both genders as much as possible in the meetings.
It's really interesting, right? Because Susan has mostly men as clients, and I'm in a bunch of groups. I mean, just as over the last few years as participant, and I've been surrounded by mostly women. And so it's what I'm seeing is the women are more in touch with the emotional intelligence and are getting into these locker rooms to learn that skill where men are not. But then you're right, men are taking the action to hire coaches to just perform better. And so it's just a really interesting, it's an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, you got it there, Rob. And I think the way to get the men is, if you're vulnerable, you're going to perform better. Then you better be attractive,
Trust me, we've been trying to make that case for some time. And that's definitely a case I laid down with the men that are in my queue, 100%. One of the things that I've noticed in my queue, speaking of which, is because of all that we've seen shaken up, right, and dislodged from the foundations of our leadership strategies over the last 3 years of the pandemic, because I think for sure a big byproduct of that has been a reality check in terms of the impact these 1.0 led cultures have, toxic work cultures have on people's mental health. We're starting to see there's this new challenge arising in almost every leader's queue, right? In terms of trying to ascertain what level of involvement or even responsibility they have where they see their people struggling from a mental health perspective. So what are your thoughts on that, right? Because I think this is relatively new space that's really opened up, and this is becoming a requisite aspect of a leader's responsibility, right? Is understanding how much they need to actually lean in, especially if somebody's isolating and trying to cope in that way that's very driven by self-preservation. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of how does a leader navigate that in terms of understanding how much involvement or engagement or intervention to have when they see their people struggling on the mental health front?
Yeah, that's a great question, Susan. And I also included a similar question in my survey in 2019, where I then asked the leaders, so if you're not feeling well and you're not talking about it in your company, will you seek professional help for it? And 75% said no. Not a surprise, but it's quite scary, right? So that means that they're walking around not feeling well and they're not seeking professional help with it. So we can imagine, and I would imagine that also the teams are not seeking professional help due to the stigma, associated with this. So you have all these people walking around, not feeling great, not asking for professional help for it. So the only thing you can do and you must do as a leader then is at least be open about it. And we come back to this, being vulnerable, talking about yourself. When you're not feeling well, share it with the team, because then they will also feel okay to open up to you when they're not feeling okay. And then we're having this open environment. And if I may, I can share a little story, which is true, from one of the women I interviewed for my book about her story. So what I did, Susan, after the survey, I interviewed some of the executives who are in the book, and most of them are anonymous for obvious reasons. So here is one senior executive, a woman who's a managing director for a big international bank. On the outside, she has it everything. She has two children in private schools who have their own nannies, car, drive private gym memberships for everyone, and really on top of her career. Everyone is looking up at her. It looks like she's living the dream life. When I interviewed her the first time here for the book, she didn't say much. She said, yeah, it's a little bit challenging now through the pandemic and so on, but then a few days later, I received an SMS and she said, can we meet again? So I went to see her over coffee, and that's when she opened up to me. She started crying and she said, Nick, I rehearsed my own suicide twice. What should I do? And there I'm sitting, and it's the first time this woman have ever shared that with anybody. But I let her cry, I let her speak, I let her listen, and then she promised me she would see a psychologist immediately. She did that. The psychologist called in the husband. The three of them had a conversation about it, and that was her return to come back to life. But I'm sharing this story because it's included in my book as an anonymous story. And what happened then was that no one in her company knew this. Everyone thought, her as a strong leader, who was always hitting the targets and doing what was expected. But she got a copy of my book and gave to all her team members, including her boss, during the lockdowns, and asked them to read it. Then they had an all-hands meeting. And in that meeting, she raised her hand and said, by the way, the woman you read about in the bank industry, that's me. And,
Whoa.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine the response from her team? And their culture changed overnight. So while, in a bank, the traditional bank, doors closed, they are open door policy. You had staff immediately sharing, oh, by the way, when I said I had a cold 2 weeks ago, I was going through something difficult. The boss came in to her and said, well, I went through something similar a few years ago. Now my wife have this issue. So, it all changed just by that. And this is what we're talking about today. It's about being vulnerable, no matter if it is something as serious as this woman who gone through suicidal thoughts. But the fact that she shared it changed everything.
Literally be life-saving. Never mind performance driving, right? But like at the bare baseline, like you just never know what that person's going through, and where that person might actually need you in that moment if you haven't created that vulnerable space or opening with your people. I want to talk about this from the other side of things, right, Rob? Like you had some stats here in terms of how the level of loneliness in executives is on the rise, especially since the pandemic, right?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to share these stats. There was a UBC report or study that came out, I think it was last week, and UBC champions mental health for men initiative called Heads Up Guys every November as part of Movember. And they put out a survey around with these statistics that are quite shocking. And basically, almost half of Canadian men meet the threshold for clinical depression, and 1 in 3 think about suicide or self-harm weekly. 55% of Canadian men report feeling lonely, and 1 in 4, 25%, said they experienced psychological pain so severe it made them feel like they were falling apart. Oh. And this is the size of the problem. It's half of people.
Wow.
And that's where, and obviously I know some of the folks who are listening are freaked out going, what would I do if, just like Nick's story, someone came up to me over coffee and said, I thought about killing myself today.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that freaks you out. And it literally, there is no answer to that question other than being there, supporting them, and making sure that they get to a hospital, doctor, psychologist support immediately, right? And it is scary. And Susan knows, because I called her with basically a very similar concern, right? And you don't have to have the answers as the leader. You don't have to have the solve, because you're not the psychologist, you're not the psychiatrist, you're not the doctor, you're not that. But if you open the space, then those 55% of men don't share it with nobody.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the piece.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they share it with you, that's the first step to them getting a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a doctor, professional help, which will help them.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the vulnerability starts. And that's where we all need to be. And yes, that's for the mental health, but it's also, like we've talked about, it's the performance also, right? Because vulnerability is not always, hey, I'm going to kill myself. Sometimes it's, hey, you know what? I made a mistake on this process, or this process doesn't work, or I don't know how to talk to this customer, right? That feedback and that psych safety, you get there through vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just full circle moment, right? Like, in terms of all you need to do is just be present, right? Like, with empathy and compassion, like everything you did for that woman in that moment, right? Like, you didn't say a word, you were just really present with her. And that's the solution in that moment. That's the support that they need in that moment, is to just know that they're not alone with that, because that's the danger zone, right? And that's why we're talking about loneliness being such a huge issue that we really need to look at in leadership. Because where people feel alone with that type of experience, especially depression, then that's where it can be, your life can be in jeopardy. So it's not about having the exact right thing to say in that moment. It's just being that 2.0 human-centric leader. That's really what we're talking about.
And you know what? When I've been in those moments, I never wanted anyone to say anything.
Yeah, that's interesting, Rob, that you say that, and I can see that. But just having that connection, just being someone having a cup of coffee, or just to be able to speak it out, as uncomfortable as it is. Once you have said the first couple of words, then it's almost like that IRONMAN finish, that the pain is over and it's just relieving, or moving away from you instantly. That's at least how I felt when I shared it with my wife, when I shared it with the doctor, and when I was in that support group room with others who were going through something similar, and I heard all of them sharing their stories, their pains. Everyone was given 2-3 minutes each. And when it came to me and I shared what I was going through, walking out of that meeting, it was like walking on clouds. You felt light again.
Mm-hmm, totally.
What are some tips that we can leave our leaders with today, just in regards to this space, right? Like, in terms of whether or not they're resonating with this themselves, or they see somebody maybe on their leadership team that might be, having some of the symptoms that we're describing in terms of the loneliness and the isolation. What are some tips that we can leave for our leaders today to really action on? Well,
I think, Rob, you shared some amazing statistics, scary statistics, and I had similar. I shared in my survey, and I can just add on also that in the major newspaper in 2021, it was similar findings. It showed that 76% of the respondents felt sad or depressed, and 65% were feeling lonely. So that was during the pandemic. So let's face it, and this is my first point here is, let's all face it, that we've gone through a very challenging time. We've been isolated, we've been remotely, we have been separated. And I think that is the first part of finding a solution, is to understand this and admit this and be open about it. So if you as a leader are talking about this inside your company, say that this is what's out there. So if you are feeling lonely, this is perfectly fine. I'm feeling like this also. So by doing that, you sort of start fishing them into the conversation. I would say that's the first step. Just admit that this is the situations that's out there. It's normal. Let's talk about it. And by the way, here are some feelings that I've gone through or during this time. And by the way, my daughter had this, my wife had this. You also show that your family is a bit vulnerable. Then you will see that the others will start to open up. And that's the start of having a more open culture. That's what I would say. And if I had one last thing to share here, it is about what you did, Rob. You started to speak up and sharing it, and what I did when I shared it with my wife. So if any one of the listener has something on their mind, some pain, some isolation feelings, or even thoughts of suicide, don't hold it to yourself. Just think of who, doesn't matter really who it is. Can you see for a coffee or a phone call, or call an anonymous hotline, and just speak up.
Whew. Nick, thank you so much for joining us. It was great to have you. And we always love to end on this question because it's our favorite question as part of the show. What do you want your legacy to be?
Mm-hmm.
The big one, and looking at Susan's sign there behind her, the purpose-driven mission, it was basically my last chapter of my book I wrote on executive loneliness, and it's about giving back. The gift I was given when I came into the rooms of recovery in 2018 is something that I want to give back for the rest of my life. I'm a volunteer today for an anonymous organization for other people who fall into alcohol addiction. I'm also a volunteer and fundraiser for a suicide hotline here. So it's about giving back the gift that I was given to me. And that is what I want to be seen for. That is what I want to be known for. I'm trying to be up every morning to do some support for my local charities around. There's so many people who need help. So that is my legacy right there. If I can just help others to go through when they have a difficult time.
That's incredible. Mm-hmm. That's amazing, Nick. And we love both of those causes. And Nick, we want to give you a time here. Where can folks find more about you, follow you, and get your book?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm quite active on LinkedIn, so they can look me up there, Nick Jonsson, NickJonsson. Otherwise, on Amazon, they can find my book, Executive Loneliness. It's up there on Amazon as a bestseller. Due to request also for many executives who don't have time to read today, it's on Audible with a professional narrator. So yeah, that's the options. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll drop Nick's LinkedIn and the link to the book in the podcast notes, so you can check it out there. I was gonna say, like, Nick, you got the professional microphone. You should have got on the narration.
Yeah. With the Shure mic.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us, obviously, hit subscribe to Leadership Launchpad Project on your favorite podcast platform. We're now available on Amazon Music, as well as Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and more. And for all leadership development, mindset, high performance, coaching, psych safety, DEI feedback, and more, head on over to elitehighperformance.com. There, Susan, is there anything you want folks to take away from this conversation?
I just love the through line between the three of us, right? Like turning that pain into purpose. And I just think, gosh, what an important message today. That's why we created locker rooms in the pandemic, Rob and I. We had that same intuitive call, right? Like people are going into the bunker, they're going into isolation. We still use isolation to torture some people in some parts of the planet still. So I mean, that was so evident to us that now really is the time more than ever for us to be curating these safe spaces so that people will really ensure that they never feel alone with whatever the adversity is that's showing up in their lane. Because as we're here to stand and use our voices towards today, like that adversity, especially when you have the safe space to work through it, is always just an opportunity for growth dressed up and disguised as adversity. So I love this interview. It totally is in alignment with everything we're on a mission to do here with our locker rooms as we try to change the way this game of life and business is being played forever.
Absolutely. I love it. And for me, I mean, first off, Nick, it was incredible to have you on. It was an incredible share that you did with us. And I have a quote here from Simon Sinek, and he says, leaders are the ones who have the courage to go first, to put themselves at personal risk, to open a path for others to follow. And that's what Nick's story, my story, Susan's story all is. Nobody has to start off telling your story on a stage or on a mic, but you can hear our stories and share your story with someone near you and open the space for them to open back up to you. And then see how that feels. See how that changes you. And who knows, you may have eventually have an experience like I did when I was in Australia this summer and I told my story and a woman came up to me at the end and said, she attempted suicide 3 times because of the asshole bosses that she had. And that is the reason why I do what I do, and the reason why Nick and Susan do what they do as well. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I hope this one wasn't too heavy for all of you. Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Rob and Susan. Been great.
Thank you, Nick.
Everybody, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye, everyone.